Last month, the deputy commander of China's Air Force, Wang, announced that the nation will soon unveil their first stealth bomber, known to most of us as the H-20. Now make no mistake, that is a pretty big deal. If and when the H-20 does enter service, it will represent the only stealth bomber on the planet that isn't housed in American hangars. But just a few days ago, an unnamed US intelligence official told Breaking Defense that China's new H-20 stealth bomber is, quote, not really a concern, before going on to suggest that this program has suffered more than its fair share of engineering hurdles and setbacks. So let's talk about what we know about China's stealth bomber program and whether or not it really might warrant at least a bit of concern. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Today's video is sponsored by Ground News, an invaluable tool for staying on top of what's going on around the world and for poking a hole in the political bias that so often skews media coverage. Ground News is an aggregator that compiles news coverage from outlets all around the world and combines them into a single, easy-to-read feed. For every story you find on Ground News, they'll give you a brief summary of the topic and make it very easy to compare headlines from different news outlets depending on their political affiliation. You can even use the location feature to see which countries are and aren't covering a story. And when you drill down toward individual outlets, it'll let you know their factuality rating based on the conclusions drawn by 3 independent news monitoring organizations and even who owns the outlet itself. Here's one example. Earlier this week, it was reported that President Biden is close to approving an $18 billion sale of F-15EX fighters to Israel. And right over here in the coverage details, I can see that 35 news outlets have already covered this story, including just 3 left-leaning outlets and 7 right-leaning ones. And by scrolling down to the bias distribution of this story, I can see that that means this coverage is a bit of a blind spot for left-leaning outlets. And these blind spots really matter. Bias in news coverage isn't just about how stories are presented, it's also about which stories outlets choose to cover. Ground News's blind spot feature gives you a list of stories that are getting a great deal of coverage only in one political sphere, allowing us to better understand how our worldviews are being shaped by the media that we consume. I don't just use Ground News for research, it's my first stop every morning, and it can be yours too for a great deal. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use, or you can try it for just $1 a month. That's less than the cost of a cup of coffee. Again, just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's or follow the link in the description below so you can make Ground News part of your day as well. Rumors of China's efforts to field a stealth attack aircraft or even strategic bomber really began in 1999 when a US Air Force F-117 was shot down over Yugoslavia. Almost immediately, Croatian military personnel began reporting on Chinese military officials, crisscrossing the territory and buying up any little bits of debris they could find from this downing, giving China what they needed to begin reverse engineering American radar-absorbent material, or the radar-absorbent skin adorning American stealth aircraft. These rumors continued to swirl until 2005, when a Northrop Grumman propulsion system design engineer named Noshir Gawadia, who worked directly on the GE F-114 turbofan engines that power the B-2 Spirit, was sentenced to 32 years in prison for selling secrets related to the B-2's propulsion system directly to the Chinese government. At that point, for most of us, it stopped being an unconfirmed rumor and started being an undisclosed effort. By 2013, early renders of this forthcoming Chinese stealth bomber reached the Chinese internet. And by 2014, China's state-owned China Daily newspaper ran a full-page feature about this bomber of the future, citing unnamed Chinese military officials and claiming that this bomber would have a range of some 8,000 kilometers. That's about 4,970 miles, while carrying payloads as big as 10 metric tons, or around 22,000 pounds. But according to an unclassified US Defense Department intelligence report published in 2021, the H-20's legs are likely longer than that, more like 8,500 kilometers or closer to 5,280 miles. That report, like Chinese media, described this bomber as capable of carrying both nuclear and conventional payloads with intercontinental ranges, which it's worth noting would suggest this could potentially be a bomber that could even strike targets inside the United States, at least hypothetically anyway. And this is where we get to the things that make this bomber not much of a concern to American intelligence officials. According to that unnamed official speaking to Breaking Defense this week, China's H-20 design does not appear to offer the same degree of low observability or stealth as even America's B-2 Spirit, which, it's worth noting, has been flying for more than 3 decades already. He went on to say, and I quote, "They've run into a lot of engineering design challenges in terms of how do you actually make that system capability function in a similar way to the B-2 or the B-21. In other words, Chinese engineers are still working out the finer points of making a stealth bomber stealth, and that shouldn't come as much of a surprise. Radar cross-sections are notoriously difficult to actually calculate, but even the most optimistic of calculations still make China's J-20 stealth fighter some 4 times bigger than the F-35 on radar screens, and that is a best-case scenario for China. Now, I realize that to some of you this may sound like I'm just cheerleading for American air power, but the truth is, there are real and legitimate reasons for China's stealth efforts to be falling well short of their American competition at this stage in its development. And that has a lot to do with experience, not just in developing and fielding these aircraft, but in incorporating stealth aircraft into China's air warfare doctrine, something we know China is still actively working on. But, to be fair, so is the United States. And when it comes to this sort of experience, there is no denying that the United States maintains a massive lead over China. Disregarding the myths you've likely heard about Germany's Horten Ho 229 being stealth, because it wasn't, the earliest formal efforts to field a low observable aircraft or to minimize an aircraft's detectability via radar date back to Project Gusto in 1957, when the US Air Force was looking to field a replacement for the U-2 spy plane. Now, that effort would culminate in fielding the SR-71 Blackbird, which many of you may know was the first operational aircraft to be fielded with intentionally stealthy design elements, including early uses of radar-absorbent materials, meant to make it harder to detect this aircraft as it screamed across the sky at Mach 3 speeds. But you may not be aware of the fact that those stealthy design elements were actually added sort of begrudgingly by Lockheed's Kelly Johnson as a result of Lockheed's competition with Convair and their Fish and subsequent Kingfish proposals, which were considered far stealthier than the Lockheed proposal. And in fact, if you look back on the Kingfish design today, you can see clear, low observable design elements that would ultimately manifest in stealth aircraft designs in the future. But while the SR-71 would ultimately be the first aircraft fielded with intentionally stealthy design elements, in 1962, Boeing began work on what aimed to be the first actually stealth aircraft, meaning the first aircraft developed from the onset to limit radar detectability. That platform was called the Model 853-21 Quiet Bird. Now, by 1962, when Quiet Bird development began, the US had already been kicking around this idea of stealth for nearly a half-decade. But at that point, there was still no way to calculate an aircraft's radar return. You had to actually stick it in front of a radar array and just see what the result was. And that's exactly how the Quiet Bird program matured. Boeing engineers at their Wichita facility would very literally just make physical changes to their Quiet Bird model and then stick it back in front of a radar array to see if its radar return got smaller. Well, the Quiet Bird never made it into service because the US Army literally lost interest in stealth at the time. Boeing translated what they learned from the Quiet Bird effort into their AGM-86 air-launched cruise missile, a low-observable long-range weapon that's still in service today. But that same year, while Boeing engineers were using the guess and check approach to low observable design, on the other side of the planet, a Soviet physicist and mathematician named Pyotr Ufimtsev was publishing his book entitled Method of Edge Waves and the Physical Theory of Diffraction, which would ultimately help the United States leave that guess and check approach to stealth design behind about a decade later when it was translated by the US Air Force's Foreign Technology Division. In 1971, a freshly translated copy of this book would find its way into the hands of Dennis Overholser, a legendary engineer in Lockheed's Skunk Works. Now, some people will try to tell you that because of this, Pyotr Ufimtsev was the Soviet godfather of American stealth, but as usual, reality is a lot more complicated than that. In reality, Ufimtsev's work was a vital piece of the puzzle, but it was far from all of it. Overholser and his mathematician colleague Bill Schroeder would incorporate elements of lots of people's work collected over more than a century, including the work of Scottish physicist James Clerk Maxwell, which was also the basis for Ufimtsev's book, as well as the radar reflectivity studies of a German engineer named Arnold Johannes Sommerfeld, and more. There were a lot of pieces to this puzzle. And by the time they were through, Overholser and Schroeder had devised a way to break up aircraft designs into a series of two-dimensional triangles, calculate the radar return of each of those elements, and then add it all together to know what an aircraft's radar cross-section would be without having to actually build it. Now, this was a massive development in stealth aviation, but even with the support of 1970s era computers, these calculations were still incredibly complex, which is part of the reason why early stealth aircraft were so angular, where you can really make out the two-dimensional triangles put together to make some of these designs. And in 1977, Lockheed's Have Blue technology demonstrator, designed using Overholser and Schroeder's approach to radar cross-section calculations, took flight for the first time. And it's important to note that this was already 2 full decades into America's pursuit of stealth technology. 6 years later, the F-117 would secretly enter service. We're now 26 years into America's pursuit of stealth technology. 14 years after that, a full 4 decades into America's pursuit of stealth technology, the B-2 Spirit would enter service as the world's first stealth-heavy payload bomber. 8 years later, the F-22 Raptor would follow suit, entering service as the world's first stealth fighter, some 48 years into America's stealth story. And today, the B-21 Raider stealth bomber and next-generation air dominance stealth fighter in active development represent the culmination of more than 67 years of stealth technology maturation, distributed across more than 28 different aircraft programs and another half-dozen missiles, and that's just the programs that have been disclosed to us. Whereas China's earliest discussions of fielding a new stealth fighter didn't emerge until the late 1990s, and the J-20 program, which would ultimately field China's first stealth aircraft, didn't begin in earnest until 2008. That's just 16 years ago. But while China's lack of experience developing stealth aircraft is a problem, China's lack of experience operating them is arguably an even bigger one. Because no matter how good your technology is, what ultimately matters is how it's implemented, how you actually use it on the battlefield. And we call our constantly growing list of hard-earned lessons about how best to use your systems and your personnel on the battlefield doctrine. And to help you understand what I mean, I'm going to quote US Air Force Manual 1 TAC 1, Basic Aerospace Doctrine of the United States Air Force. Doctrine is what we've learned about aerospace power and its application since the dawn of powered flight. While history does not provide specific formulas that can be applied without modification to present and future situations, it does provide the broad conceptual basis for our understanding of war, human nature, and aerospace power. Thus, doctrine is a guide for the exercise of professional judgment, rather than a set of rules to be followed blindly. It is the starting point for solving contemporary problems. Now, as the manual said, doctrine is not a hard and fast set of rules you use to wage war, but rather a collective education into the best practices to achieve your objectives. And as such, doctrine has to evolve and adapt right alongside the technologies you field. especially when those new technologies, like stealth, fundamentally shift not just the way you employ your forces, but even the objectives that you set, as a whole new world of targets that may have previously seemed too heavily defended to engage are suddenly within your grasp. Doctrine is not the answer to a test you can copy off a neighbor. It's a collection of lived experiences and lessons learned, sometimes external to your nation, but often internal and based specifically on the platforms you employ and the way you train your personnel. The United States has been actively cultivating and shaping its air warfare doctrine to leverage stealth technologies for more than 4 decades now, spanning more than 8 different conflicts, playing out from the tropical humidity of Panama to the arid, dry climate of the Middle East. And I'm not just talking about light use for experimental reasons. In 1991's Operation Desert Storm, the 42 F-117s the US deployed to theater represented just 2.5% of the overall coalition Air Force fleet, but still engaged more than 40% of the strategic targets throughout the breadth of the conflict. And as of April 2024, just the 990 or so F-35s delivered thus far to the United States and its allies have already accumulated a collective 811,000 hours of flight time. That is a combined 92.6 years in the sky. For China to match the collective stealth aviation experience of just the F-35 program alone, each of their 250 or so J-20s would need to rack up some 3,244 hours of flight time, which, it's worth noting, is more than half the average lifespan of a fighter. So not only does the United States have a 51-year lead on developing stealth aircraft, but it's got a 31-year lead on actually operating them. And because of the sheer volume of stealth aircraft operated by the United States and its allies, this is an experiential gap China is not going to be able to close anytime soon. And of course, before China can start cultivating experience operating a stealth, heavy payload strategic bomber, well, they've got to build one, and that's where their lack of experience in doing so rears its head once again. And in fact, everything we know about the H-20 so far falls pretty well short of the B-2 specs, which again has been flying for more than 3 decades. The H-20's anticipated range of just shy of 5,300 miles is more than 1,700 miles shy of the B-2's unrefueled 7,000-mile range. The H-20's 22,000-pound payload is less than half that of the B-2 and around 2/3 that of the forthcoming and smaller B-21 Raider. But the biggest problem facing China's new intercontinental stealth strategic bomber isn't the bomber at all. It's China's ability to get fuel to it. China's entire military apparatus to date only operates between 8 and 10 refueling tanker aircraft, whereas the United States operates north of 630. And considering the H-20's range would only allow it to take off directly from Chinese shores and barely reach the west coast, they would not only need tanker support to operate these aircraft, but they would need friendly airstrips on the other side of the planet to operate these tankers from. When you hear people ask why the US places such a heavy emphasis on alliances, geopolitical partnerships, and military installations on foreign soil, that's one of the reasons. And the truth is, China's aggressive behavior toward other nations in the Pacific has isolated them, forcing China to use things like the Belt and Road Initiative to funnel billions of dollars in loans into the developing world in hopes that those nations will default on the loans so China can seize their land to build friendly ports and airstrips. So to put it simply, even if the H-20 could match the capabilities of America's 3-decade-old B-2, which it doesn't look like it can, China's aggressive behavior toward the international community creates a strategic weakness that not even a stealth bomber can overcome. But the H-20 could represent a pretty potent threat against a nation like Taiwan, for instance, and that alone is reason to keep an eye on it. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.